I am in the studio today with the co-hosts of the top podcast, Be Bold Branding, Tonya Eberhart and Michael Carr. And we're here to talk about some of the most common branding mistakes that we see podcast hosts making all the time that cause their shows to get overlooked. And in this episode, we're going to show you how you can avoid these mistakes so that you can get more listeners clicking on your podcast. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. So Michael and Tonya, I want to start off with maybe a bit of an unconventional question for you. But before we get to the mistakes and what to avoid when branding your podcast, let's talk about what are some of the uncommon or maybe unexpected aspects of our identity that can actually become valuable components of our brands and help us stand out.
I think beyond just the personal aspects, because so many people feel like I'm going to share all the time about my business and who I can help. And those things are wonderful, right? But I think also infusing your personal side into those things, it's not just about knowing your why, it's about sharing your why, because people really do connect to that. If you think about this, you don't have businesses on your podcast, Courtney. You have people on your podcast, and those people have unique stories and they're looking for something to align with in order to do business with you. And I think that personal aspect and the why cannot be overstated.
There's a couple of points that we like to use when we're talking with our clients that are immutable laws when it comes to marketing. We all have something that we sell. We may be coaches, we may be authors, speakers, we may be real estate agents like I am, so we have these businesses, but if you sell that product, you're going to have a modicum of success. But if you sell yourself, you're going to have massive success. So I think it's really important that we approach personal branding as that's exactly what it is. Your niche is you. People say all the time, well, look, I have this brand and I'm doing this over here for myself, but then I have this book or I have this podcast or I have this webinar series or I have this coaching series, whatever. Which one do I brand? And Tonya's like, which one came first? Things that made you you were the things that made you an entrepreneur. So you are the crux of what we need to bring out to the public, because people are going to do business with a person. They're not going to do business with a logo.
So this brings up a question for me that we hear sometimes in the industry. Okay, there's a lot of personal brands, but what about if there's a point where you want to sell your company and it's so tied to you that it feels like, well, there's really no value there. I can't take it because the company's not anything without the person who created it. Let's talk about that and unpack that a little bit.
But the way I look at it is this: you want your business to be super successful until the day you decide you want to sell it. The most successful businesses have a face to the business. They have a story behind the business that belongs to that person. And so to grow a business, it's the number one way to grow a business is to attach a personal brand to that business. Perhaps the most well-known and greatest position arguably in the world is a position that changes leadership every 4 to 8 years, the President of the United States. So we have to look at the morals and values set forth for that business to continue, not just the person that's in that seat to carry forth those morals and values. So if Courtney, you're going to create this humongous business and you're going to be the face of that business is built on your morals and values and ethics and things that you feel are really important to carrying on your legacy. So even if somebody comes in and says, I want to buy that, Courtney, your name's still on it, but how are we going to work transitioning you out and transitioning the new person in? That's done all the time. I was in the media world for 18 years before Brandface came along, and I saw it happen a lot. So what happens when they want to sell that or even generationally pass it down, they bring that next person in and start to introduce them for a little while and then hand off to them. Keep in mind, with the same morals, values, concepts, dreams, legacy. So that's kind of how we look at it. There are different schools of thought. If you don't want your name on your business, that's cool. You can do it both ways, but that's our argument.
Yes. So let's talk specifically about podcasting then, because I know that there's mistakes that people make when it comes to branding. We could probably talk about those all day, but let's specifically for those here listening who have a podcast or who are thinking of starting one and they're a business owner who has a personal brand in the way that we've defined it. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see them making when it comes to standing out in their space?
I think one of the biggest ones we see is they think their podcast needs to be branded one thing and their brand is something else. For instance, if you want to be able to be big enough on Google that you have a knowledge panel, you need to have enough Google to create that ties together. If you build a brand in your podcast over here, even if you get success right off the bat and are able to work with people like you to build their show and they're getting their downloads and they're getting everything out, if you're selling a book over here and it's totally different, Google's never going to know who you are, and neither is your actual clients. So everything needs to tie to that one place, that core. Mm-hmm. Everything that you do when you start work with a podcast should stem to and from that podcast to everything else that you do. Every product that you sell, every offering that you give, it all needs to tie together.
And I have one more thing to add to that. We see a lot of people start podcasts that are passion podcasts. And that's awesome if you've got a lot of time and you don't need the money. Truly support that. And I think everybody should be in that position, but most people aren't. Most people go into this thinking, okay, this is going to help elevate me, help position me as more of an expert or authority in this subject matter, but they're really not thinking very clearly about how to attach it back to the core brand and how to utilize that podcast or leverage that podcast to actually get the right type of clients to respond to you, to want to take that next step, to get to know you better. So that's what we call profitable podcast brands, right? It's brands that you really think through that, what I call the rollover effect. So in other words, I'm utilizing this podcast to attract these types of people. Okay, either it's a type of content that your ideal customer is seeking, or you're inviting your ideal customer to your podcast. In either case, you need to have a goal in common or a goal in mind that at the end of that podcast, here's that call to action. How am I going to get people to respond that rolls them over into this particular service or product? And how do I get that service or product to roll them into the next? Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of like a linear thought process, especially for people who are what we call triple threats, podcasters, speakers, authors. They've got a podcast over here, a book here. They're trying to get on stages over here. How do you make all those work together in a linear fashion? I look at it this way. We're podcasters. We've been doing it now for about 7 years, and we've learned a lot over that time. But one of the things that we learned the most was making sure that your podcast is really targeted toward where you want to go. What is the end result you want to accomplish? And there are over 3 million podcasters now. Let's just assume for a minute that the average podcaster does like maybe an episode a week. Okay, so that's 50 50 guests that an average podcaster needs in a year. Okay, so 150 million guests out there that are needed. But that's 150 million people. How do you position yourself as a guest, and how do you position yourself as a podcaster? Because most podcasters are also podcast guests. We're guests on your show, and you were a guest on ours just last week. So we have to position ourselves properly for that. A lot of people don't look at that closely enough and taking that very seriously. It's still considered more of a passion project.
We've got listeners right now, and I talk to them every week, people who have existing podcasts. Their business has evolved. They know the podcast no longer fits and it doesn't align to the brand, to the direction, to where they're headed. But they've got concerns because they've become known under a certain name. They've gotten a certain following. They have amassed a certain number of downloads. And then they're worried about the practical stuff like, well, if I change the name, does that break all the links? What about links on the podcast? Is that going to create a lot of extra back-end work for me to rename or reposition this thing? So what exactly did that look like for you guys as you rolled that out?
It was actually a lot simpler, Courtney, and you know that. That's why you're nodding your head. It was a lot simpler than that. We didn't really lose any ground. We really hadn't gained a huge following anyway. And our podcast was really just to help us become known as authorities or experts in our space with our people. And I think really that's the number one thing I tell people. Worry about that. Don't worry about being world famous like Joe Rogan. Okay. Very few of us will ever get there, but we don't need to. So when we went to rebrand, we looked at several things. We wanted to make sure that our description was updated, that the guest profile or the guest criteria was updated. Our audience profile was pretty much the same. It was just now they would be getting information that matched with why they wanted to be attached to us in the first place. Once we poured that personal brand into that podcast and took our own advice, and it flowed so much more. Prior to it, we had the right idea. We just wanted to solve a problem that our clients were having, and we wanted to answer those questions. Fact of the matter is, we can still answer those questions under a different name. It's just much more aligned with who we're trying to attract and what we do. So logistics were super easy. I won't even go into those with you because they were so easy. We didn't really change anything that we were doing. We just changed the language we were doing it with and a few graphics.
And I'll piggyback on that. Like if you already have a podcast with a lot of downloads, a lot of listeners and followers, and like you're going in a different direction, you still have an audience. And that's why personal branding is so important, because if you build that podcast right now, especially if you're starting, and you do that from a personal branding standpoint, it doesn't matter what direction you go, you have a listenership to talk to. So if you've done that over here and you've built up a lot of success, but your business is taking you in a totally different direction, you still have that audience. You can utilize that audience. It's just like when we talked to you before about being a personal brand of your business and how do you transition that out when you sell it, you can use the exact same steps in your podcast. So if you have a big listenership, congratulations. If you're going in a different direction, you leverage that listenership.
Something else that came to mind as you were sharing, you mentioned Joe Rogan. And there's a lot of podcast hosts out there that we look up to because they are big. They have amassed that authority. But something that I'm noticing, and I'd like for you to speak to this, in the industry right now, these brands that are big and broad, that were started 5, 10, 15 years ago, that doesn't work today. And I see this in podcasting specifically. And let's look at, as an example, Amy Porterfield, Online Marketing Made Easy. And her podcast is big and broad in the sense that, yeah, it's about online marketing. Yes, it's for business owners, but we're talking about all things online marketing on that podcast. Mm-hmm. And what worked 10 years ago in the podcasting space, people are trying to replicate today, and they're struggling because they are going too broad. Can you speak to that?
Oh, my goodness, yes.
The hot topic for us.
It is. And that doesn't just apply to the broad audiences of podcasting. It applies to social media followings. Gary Vaynerchuk will be the last of his kind.
Yeah,
okay.
Those days
Stop
are over.
trying to be Gary. Stop trying to be Joe. What is happening in the social media world is that there are a lot of things that are being localized, right? And they want people to have smaller groups, to have more engagement within those smaller groups, because that tells the social platform, these people are actually interested in what I have to say. And we're engaging back and forth. That's why they reward you, but only show your post, 1/10 of the people, not even that, of the people that are in your network. I think that everybody who wants to consider a podcast should consider it solely because they can reach out to a focused, smaller group of people. It's like when I was in the media world, when the internet first came along. I'm going to date myself here. When I started in the media world, there was no internet. There was no World Wide Web. When it came along, everybody went crazy in the media world. It's like, okay, now we can take television commercials and run people to the internet, and we can sell people banner ads on our TV station website, and we can promise them all these impressions. And the first thing I noticed was, okay, I'm gonna crack the code on this right now and start teaching my clients, look, if they try to sell you impressions, don't buy the impressions. You don't want 50,000 impressions. You want to talk to 500 people that are ready to buy what you have right now today. Mm-hmm. And that's what podcasting should be about.
It is. And I'll add to that too. The world's very small with the internet, right? And that's one of the things I love about podcasting. We talk to people all over the world. And I know that's something that you got to love too. But if you focus on what Tonya just said, I want to talk to people directly interested in this niche that I'm talking to. And I am personally branded specifically for those people. And they start sharing it with the people they know, you really will have your worldwide network. There's 8 billion people on earth. So when people talk about niching down, being afraid that I won't have enough business or I won't have enough listeners, that's ridiculous. We can connect to those people if you focus on the exact person you want to talk to with the message they need.
That's so true. And look, for you listening, if you want to learn more from Michael and Tonya, I've gone ahead and linked up their podcast in the show notes for you. And then stick around, because in the next episode, we're going to be talking about the what to do's and the what not to do's of repurposing your podcast content on other platforms. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.